Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take on the essential, often agonizing conflicts of human experience and break them down into practical, surprising insights for you, the learner. Today, we are tackling a question that it really cuts straight to the core of our daily lives. How much control do we truly have over our
It's
emotions?
the ultimate human paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
That moment when you feel utterly hijacked by an emotion,
Yes.
your rational conscious brain has all the data. It says, this is fine. This fear is irrational.
Mhm.
This anger is disproportionate.
It knows. Logically, it knows.
But your body, your heart rate, your muscle tension, they are screaming a completely different, visceral, and frankly, overwhelming narrative.
Exactly. You may try to convince yourself, I shouldn't be angry at this minor traffic delay or this printer jam, but your jaw is already clenched so tight your teeth hurt,
Hmm.
your entire nervous system is braced for battle, or maybe you're sitting in a meeting feeling a wave of intense social anxiety about speaking up, even though, logically the people around the table are supportive. That racing heart, that shallow breath, that panic has already arrived long before you gave it permission.
And that conflict leads directly to the deep, honest question, our sources. And we're pulling from clinical psychology, ancient Stoicism, and modern neuroscience.
Yeah.
All address head-on.
Okay.
Are emotions things that simply happen to us, dictating our every move and reaction? Or do we possess genuine, actionable influence over how we feel?
This is the core conflict we're resolving for you today because on social media and, in pop psychology, we constantly encounter these two extreme and conflicting viewpoints.
They're everywhere.
On one side, you have the often toxic positivity crowd arguing happiness is a choice. You can choose how to feel right now.
Right. Just choose joy.
And on the other, you have the fatalists or skeptics who say, nonsense, feelings are immutable. You can't control what you feel. You can only control your outward actions.
And our mission in this deep dive is to move past that simplistic binary and find the rigorous, nuanced answer that actually helps you live better. We are synthesizing our source material to explore four key areas. What emotions fundamentally are moving beyond the simple label? How much of our emotional life is a literal, unavoidable biological reflex?
Okay, the automatic part.
Exactly. Then, where genuine influence resides in the process. And finally, what emotional responsibility truly demands of us in a complex, high-stress world.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting with a crucial redefinition. We use the word emotion all the time, but we often treat it like a vague, purely mental statement like, I am angry or I am happy.
And our sources insist that it's inadequate and dangerously misleading.
How so?
Well, that simple mental framing misses 90% of the experience. We need to stop thinking of emotions as purely internal, private thoughts or moods.
Okay.
The research we have synthesized from effective neuroscience defines emotions much more accurately as whole-body events.
Whole body events, not just in my head.
Not at all. They are an incredibly rapid, system-wide meaning response of the entire organism, the brain, the cardiovascular system, the musculature, and the hormonal system, to something it perceives as immediately important.
A meaning response. I find that phrase incredibly helpful because it implies that the body isn't just reacting randomly. It's delivering an interpretation of the environment at warp speed.
Exactly. And to appreciate the magnitude of this response, we need to detail the components involved. This is not just a thought in your head.
Right.
First, you have the immediate massive physiological changes. This involves shifts in heart rate. Is it suddenly pounding or fluttering? Changes in breathing patterns? Is it shallow and rapid or deep and expansive?
The stuff you can actually feel happen.
Yes, there's intense muscle tension, often in protective areas like the neck, jaw, shoulders, and abdomen. And crucially, there are crucial hormonal releases. A wave of cortisol, adrenaline, or dopamine floods the system, instantly changing your metabolic state and preparing you for action.
So, if I'm sitting in my car and someone cuts me off aggressively, the feeling of rage isn't just a mental choice I make to think hostile thoughts.
No.
It's the specific recipe of stress hormones, increased blood pressure, and muscle bracing that is happening beneath the surface, all triggered by a stimulus.
Precisely. That physical recipe is the emotion of anger or anxiety or excitement. And tied directly to that physical state are the incredibly powerful action urges.
Action urges.
This is the immediate, primitive biological directive.
Hmm.
Fear triggers the urge to run, freeze, or hide, fight or flight.
Sure.
Anger generates the urge to fight, push back, or lash out. Joy creates the urge to approach, hug, or draw closer to the source of connection.
That's where the internal conflict truly starts for modern people, isn't it? The body's action urge is designed for the savannah, but we're in a civilized setting.
Exactly.
The urge is to scream at the boss or slam the door, but we can't do that. That suppression of a biological urge creates immense internal pressure.
It does. The urge is a mandate from your evolutionary heritage. You feel the physical drive to behave a certain way, even if your rational mind is restraining the behavior.
And then on top of all that comes the story we tell ourselves.
Yes. Finally, we layer on the interpretive thoughts, the mental framing. This is the narrative that accompanies the physical and urged experience. The mind says, this is unfair, or I am totally incompetent, or this person loves me.
So the thoughts are trying to make sense of the tidal wave of physical stuff happening?
It's a conscious or semi-conscious attempt to make sense of it all. The essential takeaway here is that emotions are not trivial. They serve a core function. They are the brain and body trying to protect, guide, or signal something crucial to you.
They demand immediate attention. If you feel envy, the signal is protecting a perceived gap in resources or opportunity. If you feel intense anxiety, the signal is screaming, danger is imminent, prepare to survive.
But, and we must spend time on the critical caveat here because this is where influence begins. While these emotional signals are designed to protect you, they are often deeply imperfect.
Imperfect how?
They're biased and frequently exaggerated. Our system evolved to deal with acute physical threats, predators, immediate tribal conflict.
Right, a lion in the grass.
Exactly.
Ugh.
It did not evolve to deal with credit card debt, passive-aggressive emails, or the constant low-level threat of social media comparison.
So the signal is valid, something important is happening, but the volume is often set far too high for the actual situation.
That's a perfect way to put it. Your emotional system is biased by your unique personal history. If you grew up in an environment where small failures were met with disproportionate criticism,
Okay.
your nervous system will carry a scar or a template that makes it hair-trigger sensitive to perceived failures or criticism in adulthood. You perceive a critical email with the same intensity your system would reserve for a physical attack.
Because that template was set when the consequences of disapproval felt life-threatening.
Right. So understanding that the signal might be distorted, that your nervous system is reacting to a ghost from the past, is the absolute first step toward gaining influence.
That sets up our next major point perfectly, establishing the unchangeable truth about our limits. Because if emotions are these rapid, whole-body meaning responses shaped by evolution and personal history, then the first truth we have to accept is that we do not have full, direct, immediate control over what emotions initially appear. They arrive uninvited.
This is the hard truth that makes simplistic advice like just choose joy completely useless and frankly invalidating for many people.
Right. It feels like you're failing if you can't.
We must spend time distinguishing between the initial spark, which is largely involuntary, and the subsequent sustained emotional fire, which is where choice resides.
Okay, so give us some richer, more detailed examples of this initial uncontrollable flash that our sources emphasize.
Well, consider classic Pavlovian conditioning applied to human social life. You don't decide to be startled. You startle at the loud, sudden noise, physically jumping before you've consciously assessed the danger.
It's a reflex.
That physical jerk is a biological mandate. Or think about positive triggers. The surge of warmth and connection, the oxytocin release, that happens the instant you hug a child or see a loved one after months apart.
You didn't choose that. It just happens.
You didn't choose to initiate that hormonal rush. The biological system recognized the connection and activated the safe and connected response instantly.
I think about the involuntary nature of memory triggers, too. The way sadness or immense grief can appear instantly, triggered by something as abstract as a familiar scent linked to a painful loss,
Yes.
or a specific piece of music tied to a breakup. You haven't chosen to think about that painful event.
The memory bypasses conscious thought, goes straight to the limbic system, and hits the nervous system with a shockwave of cortisol and sorrow.
It just arrives.
That is the speed differential at play, and this is where we need to delve into the neuroscience, because it's a non-negotiable biological fact. Emotions arise faster than conscious thought.
Faster.
The neural pathways for threat processing are fundamentally shorter than those for rational processing.
Okay, let's unpack this technical detail, because this is where the deep dive earns its name. What does shorter pathway actually mean in the brain?
We rely on the famous distinction made by neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux, often called the low road versus the high road.
Okay, low road, high road.
Imagine a potential threat enters your senses. You see a shadow move quickly in the corner of your eye, or hear a sudden crash. That sensory information goes straight to the thalamus, which is the brain's relay station.
The central hub.
Right. The low road is the fast, immediate, rough draft pathway. The thalamus sends a signal directly to the amygdala, the brain's central alarm bell and threat processing center.
Okay.
This pathway takes milliseconds. The amygdala doesn't need context or logic. It initiates the fight-or-flight response immediately. Your heart starts pounding, your muscles tense. That's the involuntary initial spark.
So the body's already reacting before I even know what I'm reacting to. The noise happens, the jump happens, and then my rational brain plays catch-up.
Precisely. The high road is the slower, more detailed, conscious pathway. The thalamus also sends the signal to the sensory cortex and the prefrontal cortex, the areas responsible for rational thought, context, decision-making, and analysis.
And that takes longer.
It takes longer. It's only when the signal reaches the prefrontal cortex that you consciously realize, oh, that wasn't a snake, that was just a garden hose, or that wasn't a threat, that was just my phone falling.
So by the time the rational self is ready to issue the logical command, this is inappropriate, I shouldn't feel this way, the nervous system, having traveled the low road, is already fully activated.
Yes, the physiological chain reaction is well underway.
Wow. And you mentioned history plays a role here too.
We must recognize the deep roots of these instant reactions. Beyond the evolutionary heritage, there's the profound impact of personal history. Early attachment styles, how consistently your needs were met as an infant, or chronic stress and trauma in childhood create permanent templates.
They wire you a certain way.
Those early experiences literally wire the amygdala to be more reactive or hypervigilant. If the template established in your first few years says the world is unsafe, your body will respond to small uncertainties in adulthood, like a delayed text or an unfamiliar new task, with the disproportionate intensity of a life-or-death crisis.
And let's not forget the inherent biological factors, pure temperament and unique biological wiring.
That's right. We know some people are simply born with a more reactive nervous system. They might score high on novelty-seeking or have a higher baseline level of neuroticism. This isn't a moral feeling. It's just biology.
Okay.
So given all this, if we define control as, I can decide never to feel fear, anger, or sadness when a trigger is present, or stop the initial low-road activation.
Which is what a lot of people think it means.
It is. Then the conclusion, supported by all our sources, is a firm no. That level of direct, preemptive control is biologically impossible and, as we said earlier, fundamentally unhealthy.
Why unhealthy?
Emotions carry vital information. Trying to suppress the initial signal is sacrificing the system's ability to alert you to danger, connection, or meaning.
Okay, that establishes the boundary. The initial spark is largely involuntary. But if that was the entire story, then Stoicism wouldn't have survived 2,000 years.
Right.
And CBT wouldn't be a cornerstone of modern therapy. This is where the story changes completely.
This is the moment of agency.
We are shifting now from the initial involuntary reaction to what happens next. Our sources define this as the area of genuine freedom that resides between the initial automatic wave of emotion and the subsequent chosen action.
This space is the critical juncture of human responsibility and capacity for growth. Even if the feeling is uncontrollable, that initial spike of fear or jealousy or indignation, our influence is substantial in key areas.
We can't control the wave, but we can learn to surf it.
We can learn to surf it, and we can choose whether or not to feed it.
So let's focus on that key distinction, because this is where the listener gains power. I can't always control the fact that I feel a surge of rage when someone cuts me off in traffic and yells an insult.
Correct. That is an almost instantaneous protective response.
Right.
But the moment that initial surge hits, that powerful low-road activation, your high road, your prefrontal cortex, begins to activate moments later. That is your window of freedom.
Okay, so what can I do in that window?
You can instantly influence the story you tell yourself about that anger. Do you immediately escalate and decide this person is fundamentally evil, they are deliberately disrespecting me, and I must retaliate?
Which just pumps more adrenaline into the system.
Which pumps more adrenaline and fuels the rage into a sustained 20-minute emotional event. Or do you acknowledge the surge, notice the racing heart, and choose to allow the peak intensity to pass, withholding judgment until your system calms down?
I see. That choice to feed the narrative and sustain the fire, or to notice the fire and let it naturally burn down, is where our agency resides. And what's fascinating is how this insight is completely consistent across multiple schools of thought, separated by millennia. Let's look at three powerful frameworks that define this area of freedom.
It's a powerful testament to the universality of human experience that a Roman emperor, a Tibetan monk, and a modern clinical psychologist are all defining the same internal process, just with different terminology.
Let's start with Stoic philosophy, which provided an extraordinarily durable method for emotional influence. They are often mischaracterized as cold or emotionless,
Very misunderstood.
but that misses their nuanced distinction.
Their insight is the distinction between impressions, fantasia, and assent, sankatathesis.
Okay, break those down.
Impressions are those immediate involuntary elements. The emotion rising, the spontaneous thought that flashes into the mind, often judgmental like, this is terrible. The Stoics accepted these are involuntary, they just happen to the animal part of us.
So the impression is the initial automatic judgment, the first thing the mind says when the body gets triggered. The body tenses and the thought flashes, this is unfair.
Precisely. But then comes assent. This is the conscious choice, the voluntary act of whether to agree with those impressions, attach judgment to them, and build a logical structure upon them that validates the emotion.
So the impression is the spark and assent is the fuel.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
The Stoics recognize that the short-lived, immediate feeling only becomes a destructive, sustained, passion-like rage or despair when we lend our assent to the accompanying judgment.
Let's use a detailed, practical scenario here. I'm waiting for a major presentation I gave to be graded, and I see I received a B, which is lower than I expected.
The impression is immediate. A spike of anxiety, a rush of disappointment, and the thought flashes, I feel hurt. This grade proves I am a failure.
That's the involuntary part.
Involuntary. Now you hit the fork in the road, the moment of assent.
Option A, fueled by assent to the impression. I agree with the negative judgment. This grade is proof I'm a failure. This is unbearable. My career is over. The professor hates me.
You've chosen to internalize the catastrophic judgment, and the disappointment transforms into sustained self-loathing or hostile resentment toward the professor.
And option B?
And option B, the wise response, fueled by withholding assent. You acknowledge the initial hurt. You think, I feel disappointed and I don't like this grade. But you withhold the judgment that the grade equals failure.
You just observe.
You observe it, and you remind yourself of the Stoic principle that external things, grades, other people's opinions, are fundamentally outside of your control. The feeling is painful, but you don't allow it to become destructive passion. You respond wisely by seeking feedback for the next assignment.
So the core Stoic takeaway is that control is not over the rising hurt, but over the judgment you attach to it. That judgment, this external event is inherently bad and unacceptable, is the essential fuel for sustained emotional suffering.
Without the fuel of judgment, the initial impression tends to fade quickly because it has nothing to hold on to.
Okay, now let's pivot to a completely different system, Buddhist and mindfulness traditions, to see the same truth through a different lens.
Right. They approach this not through rational logic and judgment, but through awareness and acceptance.
The core insight here, which is very popular now, is the understanding that emotions are intrinsically temporary. They arise and pass like waves in the ocean.
Yes, and if you are surfing a wave, you don't suppress it, but you definitely don't become the wave either.
So what's the practice?
The key Buddhist practice is non-reactive observation without immediate identification or suppression. The focus is on cultivating the ability to witness the emotional and physical experience with a detached curiosity.
You're just watching it.
You acknowledge its presence, you feel the physical sensations it creates, but you do not attach the narrative of self to it.
And this is why the shift in language is so critical. Instead of saying, I am anger, which implies complete identity and permanence,
Right.
the practice shifts the language dramatically.
You move to objectifying the experience just enough to create distance. Ah, anger is here. Fear is rising in my chest, a physical tightening. A wave of sadness is present.
Or, using the weather analogy that is common in mindfulness, there is a sudden storm of anxiety moving through the mindscape.
Exactly.
What is the measurable effect of that simple renaming, that subtle linguistic adjustment?
It creates that necessary, powerful, small space, that gap between the stimulus and the response. When you say, I am angry, anger feels infinite, totalizing, and necessary. The self is inseparable from the feeling.
Right.
But when you recognize anger is here, you recognize it as a temporary phenomenon passing through you. This allows you to ride the wave without immediately drowning in it or acting impulsively, giving your prefrontal cortex time to engage.
It's an exercise in decentralizing the ego from the emotional state.
That's a great way to put it.
This is where I want to pause and introduce a potential complication for the listener. How do the Stoic idea of challenging the judgment and the Buddhist idea of non-judgmental observation truly reconcile? They seem to be pulling in slightly different directions.
That's an excellent, necessary clarification.
Yeah.
They are complementary, but they operate at slightly different levels of intervention.
Okay.
The Buddhist path is fundamentally about acceptance and non-identification. The emotion is seen as pure energy, a sensation. By observing it without judgment, you prevent the energy from becoming stuck or reinforced.
You're teaching the system. I don't need to do anything about this feeling. I just watch it until it passes.
Exactly. The Stoic path is more about active, rational intervention. The Stoic says, the reason this feeling is painful is because I am agreeing with a false premise, judgment. I must actively introduce reason to refute that premise.
So one is passive observation, the other is active challenge.
The Buddhist says, just watch the feeling. The Stoic says, challenge the thought. But both, critically, rely on creating that initial space between the involuntary impression and the subsequent chosen engagement with it. You need the Buddhist pause to implement the Stoic challenge effectively.
That brings us perfectly into the modern clinical version, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. This model gives us a clinical, scientific structure for the same core concept.
It does. CBT provides a clear, actionable pathway, often defined as STEB. A situation leads to a thought or interpretation, which triggers an emotion, which ultimately leads to a behavior.
And like we said, you can't control the situation, nor the initial emotional flicker.
But the immense influence enters right at the thought interpretation stage, which is structurally identical to the Stoics' ascent. We are taught to become scientific observers of our own mental output.
You're challenging the thoughts that fuel the emotional intensity.
Yes. Let's use a highly detailed example. You have a long, difficult day at work, and you come home to find your partner forgot to run an important errand, like picking up medication or paying a critical bill.
Okay, a real-life stressor.
Your initial thought might be catastrophic and personal. This proves they don't respect me at all. They are fundamentally lazy and selfish. I cannot rely on them.
That catastrophic, totalizing thought is the fuel, similar to the Stoics' negative judgment. That thought immediately triggers overwhelming rage, despair, or self-pity.
Exactly. CBT teaches you a three-step process to challenge that automatic thought. Step 1, identify the thought. They are lazy and selfish.
Okay.
Step 2, examine the evidence for and against the thought. Evidence for, they forgot the errand. Evidence against, they handled 3 other complicated tasks today. They usually are highly reliable. They seem stressed earlier.
You're being a detective of your own mind.
You are. And step 3, develop an alternative, more balanced thought.
So what would that be?
The alternative thought might be, they were clearly overwhelmed today, and while forgetting the bill is a serious problem that needs to be addressed, it is likely due to stress, not a lack of fundamental respect for me.
The resulting emotion changes completely. You still feel frustration, annoyance, and perhaps moderate pain because the situation is real.
Of course.
But the feeling is moderated from overwhelming rage or despair down to manageable frustration. It's painful, not overwhelming.
The synthesis is clear across all 3 traditions. While the initial emotional spark is outside the realm of voluntary choice, we possess immense trainable influence over how large the emotional fire becomes, how long it burns, and what actions we take while standing in its heat.
It shifts the focus from an impossible task suppressing the involuntary signal to an achievable lifelong skill. Intelligently regulating the response. I love that framework. Regulating the response rather than suppressing the signal. Now, we've mostly talked about what to do in the moment or after the emotion hits, but the science of emotion regulation also reveals powerful upstream strategies.
Yes, this is about prevention.
We can shape our emotional life proactively before specific emotions even show up. Our sources highlight 3 powerful levers that are about prevention and preparation.
And these proactive strategies are often the most overlooked, yet the most effective, because they prevent unnecessary and costly activation of the emotional system in the first place. You're essentially managing the input system.
Let's start with situation selection. This sounds obvious, but I think people often passively walk into situations that guarantee a negative emotional outcome.
It happens all the time. We have a genuine daily choice over the environment and the exposure we seek out, and that choice limits potential emotional triggers.
It's about self-preservation through boundaries and planning.
Exactly. If, for example, that excessive consumption of alcohol or caffeine inevitably sends you into a state of anxiety or a depressive emotional spiral the next day. Choosing to limit or abstain is a powerful act of situation selection. If you know that spending 2 hours in a particular Facebook group or around a relative who constantly criticizes you always results in shame, defensiveness, and anger, then minimizing that exposure is not cowardly. It is a sophisticated, responsible, emotional strategy.
I see the modern relevance here, especially with media consumption. Our sources talk about how the media is often structurally designed to keep us emotionally aroused, specifically through outrage.
Precisely. Choosing to consume 24/7 outrage media is situation selection. Every minute you spend reading a fight on Twitter or watching a cable news show designed to elicit maximum disgust or anxiety means you are voluntarily saturating your system with low-level threat signals.
And that depletes your emotional reserves.
It does. You are essentially setting your baseline cortisol and adrenaline levels higher, making you less resilient when a real problem, a flat tire, a genuine argument, actually arises.
So the key point is that control isn't about controlling the emotion itself in the moment, but controlling the likelihood of the emotion arising by controlling the inputs. We can't control everything, but we can influence how many unnecessary emotional storms we deliberately invite ourselves into.
It's the difference between standing outside during a lightning storm and watching the storm safely from indoors. You respect the power of the lightning, but you don't expose yourself to unnecessary risk.
The second upstream lever is perhaps the most profound in the modern attention economy. Attention. Our attention is an almost magical determinant of our baseline emotional state, yet we rarely treat it as a resource.
Absolutely. The mind is a spotlight, and where you consciously and habitually shine that spotlight shapes your reality. If you operate from a constant negative focus, if you are always scanning your environment, your body, and your relationships for threats, potential failures, or microaggressions,
You're training your system to live in anxiety and defensiveness. We often call this threat scanning.
and what's the neurological cost of threat scanning? You're constantly activating the reticular activating system, or RAS, which filters incoming information based on what you deem important.
Okay.
If you train your RAS that threats, danger, and reasons to be offended are important, it will filter reality to highlight those inputs. This keeps your amygdala on edge and cultivates fear and anger. It's a self-fulfilling negative loop.
But the reverse is also true.
Conversely, yes. Training your attention toward the positive and noticing what is functional and constructive in your life cultivates calm and appreciation.
Like practicing gratitude.
Practicing gratitude, for example, is not about denying real problems. It's just a deliberate, systematic act of redirecting attention toward the small, positive things, the warm coffee, the successful meeting, the moment of connection that we usually filter out as irrelevant.
This sounds like we are building a completely different set of neural pathways over time.
Precisely. We are building neural habits. We may not control every passing thought or stimulus that hits the brain, but we can train where we consciously return our attention. That focused training defines your emotional baseline over weeks and months.
You're literally making the high road more traveled and responsive.
That's a great way to think about it.
The third upstream lever is interpretation, which we touched on with the Stoics, but we need to reinforce it as a proactive skill. Our explanation of events changes how we feel about them immediately, and we are constantly jumping immediately to catastrophic or negative interpretations.
This is where the emotional drama often originates. We don't just feel an emotion, we construct a story around it instantly. Clinically, this is about identifying and challenging cognitive distortions like catastrophizing
Assuming the worst-case scenario is certain.
and mind reading.
Assuming you know someone else's hostile intentions.
Let's use a common workplace scenario. A colleague fails to share key information with you before a client meeting, and the meeting goes badly. The initial negative interpretation leaps in. They deliberately sabotaged me because they want my job. They are trying to make me look incompetent. This interpretation leads to immediate anger and paranoia.
And what's the alternative interpretation?
The alternative interpretation requires using that proactive muscle before the emotional spike solidifies. They might have been genuinely overwhelmed and forgot to loop me in. They might be struggling with a problem I don't know about.
That alternative shifts the resulting emotion from corrosive anger and paranoia to moderate annoyance, combined with a sense of professional curiosity or compassion.
Exactly. So your action changes. You don't send a hostile email. You schedule a direct, calm conversation to ask what happened. Learning to question these immediate negative or self-serving interpretations is one of the most powerful, learnable emotional skills we possess.
You're shaping the event's meaning before the full, painful emotional response has a chance to solidify and dictate your actions. That covers the proactive, upstream strategies, prevention, and preparation. But now, let's deal with the reality of life. What happens when you're already in the thick of it? The emotion has arisen, you're highly activated, and you feel the physical surge. The low road has won the first round.
Right.
This brings us to the downstream regulation section, the immediate, actionable steps to manage the reaction after the spark has flown.
Once the intense emotion is present, we move from prevention to skill application. The very first step, which has robust neuroscientific evidence, is simply to name it.
That's labeling, right? Simply articulating internally or externally what you're feeling. I feel anxiety, I feel shame, or I recognize a wave of frustration.
Yes, and the source material highlights that this simple act of linguistic labeling has a measurable, tangible neurological effect, often referred to as affect labeling.
What's it doing in the brain?
When you consciously assign a linguistic label to a raw emotional state, it engages the language and executive function centers in the prefrontal cortex, the high road.
And what happens in the brain when the prefrontal cortex gets involved?
It creates a dampening effect on the limbic system. Studies show that merely labeling an intense emotion slightly lowers the intensity of the emotional response in the amygdala, the alarm center.
So it's not a magic switch that turns off the emotion.
Not at all.
But it's like turning the volume down just a notch or two. And that tiny notch is critical because it gives you the processing space you need.
It increases clarity and turns internal amorphous chaos, that confusing, overwhelming, shapeless feeling, into something finite, recognizable, and manageable.
And crucially, naming reinforces the critical distance we discussed earlier.
It allows you to state, I have this emotion, rather than sinking into the identity, I am this emotion. It creates separation.
So once we've named it and gained that tiny bit of distance, what's the next immediate strategy? Given that we established emotions are physical, hormonal events, the next step must also be physical.
Absolutely. That's where breathe and ground comes in. Since the emotional system is housed in the body through muscle tension and adrenaline surges, we must use the body to regulate it.
And the quickest way is through the breath.
The quickest way to signal to the nervous system that the threat is not imminent, that you are safe enough to stop preparing for battle, is through the breath. It's the voluntary lever we have over the involuntary autonomic nervous system.
So how does that work mechanistically?
Slowing the breath, particularly focusing on extending the exhale, stimulates the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve runs from the brainstem down to the abdomen and is the primary communication line of the parasympathetic nervous system.
The rest and digest or calming system.
Right. So by using conscious, slow breathing, like a 4-second inhale, 7-second hold, 8-second exhale, you are physically, chemically communicating to your brain, the danger has passed, we can relax now.
That's a sophisticated biological intervention. And what about the grounding part?
Grounding is equally essential. It involves consciously relaxing tense, braced muscles, the jaw, the shoulders, the fists, and rooting oneself in the present physical reality, rather than the abstract catastrophe running in your head.
Like feeling your feet on the floor.
Exactly. Focusing on the physical sensation of your feet on the floor, noticing 5 distinct things you can see, or focusing on the texture of the chair beneath you. The effect of this combination is profound. It doesn't erase the emotion, but it drastically lowers the physiological arousal level.
And that gives the mind sufficient time and space to activate the rational self and choose the next action.
Right, rather than just being propelled by the biological action urge.
Once that physical space is created, we can return to the active cognitive work, which is reappraisal or deeper reinterpretation.
Yes. When you're intensely emotional, your mind often defaults to the most negative, self-serving, or self-pitying narrative. Reappraisal is about challenging that narrative, but gently, now that the immediate physical intensity has dropped.
And it's not denial. It's not saying, I'm fine, nothing is wrong.
Not at all. It's an act of seeking external, broader perspective.
So we've calmed the body, we've named the emotion. Now, what are some of those internal questions we should be asking ourselves to engage in constructive reappraisal?
We want to ask questions that broaden the frame. Questions like, if I look at this situation through the lens of a year from now, how important will this event be?
Okay, that's a good one.
Is there genuinely another way to look at this, a more compassionate or functional interpretation that I haven't considered? What might I be missing about the other person's stress or intentions?
And you mentioned one that's particularly powerful.
Yes, perhaps the most powerful. If my closest, most valued friend was in this exact painful situation, what compassionate and realistic advice would I give them?
That last one is incredibly powerful because we reserve an immense capacity for perspective and kindness for others that we often withhold from ourselves in the heat of the moment.
We see their context, but we only see our own pain.
So, reappraisal is not about pretending the hurt or anger isn't real. It's about actively trying to see more of the picture than the immediate tunnel visioned, threat based narrative allows.
It expands the context, which naturally lowers the emotional intensity and allows for a non-reactive response.
And finally, after all those regulatory steps, naming, breathing, reappraisal, we arrive back at the final and most crucial point of influence and responsibility. Choose behavior.
This is the ultimate non-negotiable point. This is where the initial involuntary feeling meets the choice of action. Even when the emotion is strong, even when the rage is still simmering or the fear is still palpable, choice over action remains.
Your powerful emotions are not a blank check or an automatic excuse for your actions.
That is the core lesson across all the disciplines we reviewed. From Marcus Aurelius to modern therapy, you have specific choices. What you say, or often more importantly, what you don't say, what you do, and whether you create distance.
Give us an example of that choice in action.
The example here is what separates the regulated person from the reactive person. You may feel incandescent rage, a legitimate initial response to a betrayal or insult, but you consciously choose not to insult the person back, not to lash out physically, or not to burn a bridge you might regret.
You choose to step away.
You choose to step away and say, I need 20 minutes to process this before I can speak constructively. Or conversely, you might feel intense, debilitating fear and anxiety about public speaking.
But you do it anyway.
But you still decide to show up, to speak, and to engage in the action that aligns with your long-term values, even while shaking.
So that is the crucial conclusion. We are not fully responsible for what we feel. That initial automatic low-road activation is biology and history.
But we are absolutely responsible within our capacity for what we do with that feeling, especially the learned behavioral habits we allow to take root. That's the distinction.
That is a very clean distillation of responsibility. Now, before we close this loop, we have to inject a necessary, profound dose of humility and compassion into this discussion.
Yes, this is a vital caveat.
Because talking about control and choice can sound very simple, even punitive, especially for those who struggle significantly with emotional overwhelm. Emotional regulation is not an equally simple skill for everyone.
Any discussion of responsibility that neglects context is incomplete and often cruel. The reality is that the capacity for emotional regulation, the size of that space of freedom, is severely affected by individual context and biology.
For some, the low road is simply much wider and faster. Let's start with trauma history, which is perhaps the most obvious factor in hyperreactivity.
A history of significant, often chronic, trauma or neglect means the nervous system has been fundamentally restructured. The primary mechanism of survival becomes hypervigilance.
So certain situations can just bypass the rational brain entirely.
Yes, a sudden shift in tone, feeling trapped, perception of powerlessness. These can trigger an intense, rapid, and overwhelming emotional response. For these individuals, the initial emotional spark is not just a flicker. It is a full-scale biological explosion that feels exactly like the original threat.
And telling them to just breathe can feel deeply invalidating.
It can. Then there are specific mental health conditions that chemically alter the system.
Right.
Absolutely. Conditions like major anxiety disorders, borderline personality disorder, severe depression, bipolar disorder, and PTSD directly affect the intensity and capacity for regulation. For someone with a generalized anxiety disorder, the intensity of fear is chronically chemically higher due to imbalances in neurotransmitters.
So they're operating from a deficit of calm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the ability to reappraise or breathe through it is diminished by that underlying physiological difference. We must stress, it's a physiological deficit in regulation capacity, not a lack of willpower or moral commitment.
And we also need to consider neurological differences that change processing time and executive function.
Yes, conditions like ADHD or autism can change how emotions are processed internally. For some neurodivergent individuals, emotional experience is often felt with greater intensity.
Dysregulation.
Dysregulation, or the complexity of the emotion, is difficult to categorize accurately. Crucially, the executive function required to apply those downstream skills, to pause, name it, or initiate a complex reappraisal, is inherently slower or harder to access. That space for freedom is extremely narrow, sometimes feeling non-existent.
And finally, a factor often ignored in clinical discussions but highlighted by socioeconomic research: chronic stress and poverty.
When survival is consistently threatened, whether by physical danger, crushing financial insecurity, or systemic discrimination, the body exists in a state of sustained allostatic load. The emotional system is permanently set on high alert because the threats are real and ongoing. The body is continually awash in cortisol.
So there's no reserve capacity left.
When you are worried about making rent, feeding your family, or facing discrimination every day, your system has virtually no cognitive or hormonal reserve capacity left for intentional regulation. Your energy is spent on survival. Asking someone under chronic stress to perform conscious reappraisal is asking them to use resources they simply don't have.
That changes the entire context of responsibility. For some, control your emotions is not a life hack. It requires long-term support, therapeutic intervention, perhaps medication, and deep healing just to get their nervous system to a baseline where these tools can even begin to work effectively.
The synthesis is clear. Any discussion of emotional capacity or responsibility must be accompanied by context and compassion regarding these very real physiological and environmental limits. For many, emotional resilience is a profound, supported journey toward healing, not a single decision of willpower.
That structural compassion is crucial. So let's wrap this up by synthesizing everything we've learned into a rigorous definition of true emotional responsibility, moving past the unrealistic expectation of perpetual serenity.
Let's start by defining what emotional responsibility is not. It is not achieving a state of emotional zero-sum. It is not never feeling anger, fear, or jealousy again.
Those feelings are indicators of what you value and what you need.
Exactly. It is certainly not always being calm and positive, which often just means you're suppressing natural signals that need to be heard.
So what is it then? Drawing from the consistency of our sources, the first element of responsibility is recognizing what you feel.
Yes, doing so with honesty, without shame, and without denial. Just having the clarity and maturity to admit, I am intensely jealous right now, or I am terrified of this change, is the foundational act of responsibility.
The second is owning your reactions.
This is the behavioral component that exists in that space of freedom.
Yeah.
It means refusing to use the manipulative, blame-shifting phrase, you made me angry, or you made me lash out.
Right.
Instead, it is the maturity to say, I did this behavior while I was angry, and regardless of the trigger, I need to own the behavior and the negative impact of my chosen actions. You own the action, not the initial feeling.
Third, it means working on patterns.
Yes. Responsibility means moving beyond eternally blaming external factors or one's inherent reactive nature. It means committing to the gradual, imperfect process of learning and practicing those upstream and downstream skills we detailed, thus improving your response over time. It is a commitment to incremental growth.
And
finally, a very responsible act is seeking help when needed. Acknowledging my capacity is overwhelmed, I cannot handle this alone. And reaching out for therapy, professional support, or structured community practice is not a failure of responsibility. It is the ultimate courageous act of taking responsibility.
that completes the full picture. You are not guilty for your initial automatic emotions, those rapid meaning responses based on deep history and biology.
But you are gradually responsible for how you meet those emotions, with awareness or denial, and for the behavioral habits you consistently build around them.
So to give you, the learner, our final, nuanced answer to the opening question, how much control do we really have over our emotions?
We must conclude that we do not fully control the initial emotions that spontaneously arise. Biology, trauma, and history dictate that powerful initial spark.
But we have immense trainable influence, especially over the long term, through the conscious choice of our environment, the redirection of our attention, the proactive shaping of our interpretations, and the diligent building of wise regulatory habits.
And our greatest non-negotiable area of responsibility is what we do with the emotion. Our words, our actions, our willingness to pause, to apologize, and to learn from the inevitable intensity of human feeling.
This means emotions are not enemies to crush, nor are they dictators we must obey. They're simply powerful signals, sometimes accurate and necessary, sometimes distorted and exaggerated, calling for your attention, your understanding, and your wise, non-reactive response.
We may not choose the first wave of emotion,
But we can absolutely learn to surf it, ride it out, instead of denying that it exists at all or being dragged under by its current.
and this leads us to the final provocative thought for you to carry forward, based on synthesizing all these traditions. Stop striving for the impossible goal of control.
So what's the better question to ask?
Instead, ask yourself this: The real question is not, can I control my emotions completely? But rather, can I learn to relate to my emotions, even the painful, ugly ones, in a way that is wiser, kinder, more curious, and ultimately more aligned with the person I genuinely want to become?
That shift from rigid control to a thoughtful, mature relationship with your feelings changes everything.